How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Monday? Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Stephen in New Hampshire, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bill in Missouri, Guy in Ohio, Yehuda in South Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Chaim in Florida, Frank in San Pedro, Ella and Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Another short daf. Bava Basra just has a lot of these short pages. Remember when we first started 4 years ago? Almost 4 years ago? And Tractate Brachas has some of the longest pages. So right when you first start Daf Yomi and learning a page a day, they're such long pages where it can easily take well over an hour to get through them, even when you're moving at a rapid clip. But here in the middle of our journey, or well past the halfway point, there are 2,711 pages in the Talmud, and we have covered 1,719 of them. So less than 1,000 to go, and God willing, we'll all finish our journey together sometime in the summer, I think maybe August of 2027. Today's daf is page 86 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 5. Today continuing our discussion of Mishna number 8. And we're talking about how is a kinyan made, how is a formal act of acquisition made. Just because two parties have agreed that one is going to sell and the other is going to buy something, even when the money has changed hands, the buyer has not legally, formally acquired the property that is the subject of the sale. And if something were to happen to it while it's still in the seller's possession, so it's the seller's responsibility to pay for it or make up for it. He hasn't delivered the property yet. When the buyer does this formal act of acquisition, then the deal is finalized. They can't renege on it. And the buyer now has the property. And then depending on the kind of property, if we're talking about land, if we're talking about animals, if we're talking about produce, if we're talking about a small bag of produce, if we're talking about a very large bag of produce, as we shall see today, there will be different actions that constitute that formal act of acquisition. And again, this was in a society where typically there was very little set down on paper. Almost everything was done by oral agreements. And so this formal act of acquisition was something that could be seen, could be witnessed by those people who are acting as the witnesses. Okay, we picked this up about halfway down on page 86a. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere in Tractate Kiddushin, page 26a, property that is guaranteed, and that means land, is acquired by means of money, right? When the money changes hands, in the case of land, or by means of a bill of sale, or by taking possession of it. And property, taking possession of it, like you start using it, right? That can be the act of acquisition. Now, that doesn't mean that just because you go squat on somebody's property, you took possession of it, you have acquired it. This would be the final act of acquisition in a legal purchase and sale. Now, property that does not have a guarantee. Now we're talking about movable property as opposed to land. This can be acquired only by means of pulling. That's what that Mishnah said in Tractate Kiddushin, but that contradicts what we've been saying here, that there are other means of acquisition other than pulling. Pulling is, for example, if you're buying a donkey, so you take the reins of the donkey and you make him move a step. So now the buyer has exerted authority over the animal, and if the context of an agreement to sell the animal, when he pulls it, he has officially taken possession of it. So that's pulling. Or if you literally haul, a bag of produce, you pulled it, you moved it from its place. We talked about that a boat, if you cause it to move from its place. Now, in Surah, they taught, Surah was a city in Bava, which is the Babylonia, which at the time of the Talmud was a part of the Persian Empire. So in Surah, they taught this following law, in the name of Rav Chizda, while in Pumbedisa, another city with a Jewish community in Bavel, they taught this teaching in the name of Rav Kahana. And some say it was taught in the name of Rava. These are all sages. And they taught that movable property is acquired by means of pulling only with regard to items that are not typically lifted due to their weight or for some other reason. But in the case of items that are typically lifted, then yes, they are acquired by means of lifting, but they are not acquired by means of pulling. So here we're now asking, well, wait a minute. So, okay, movable property, we see that sometimes it can be acquired by lifting, sometimes it can be acquired by pulling. So if it's possible to lift it, but you pulled it, does that mean that you did complete the act of acquisition or not? If it's possible to lift it, does that mean that you must use lifting as the means of acquisition? Or does that mean it's one of the options, right? Sharpening our thinking. So Abaye sat and related this law. Rav Ada bar Matana raised an objection to Abaye from a baraisa, a teaching contemporaneous with but slightly less authoritative than a Mishnah. One who steals a purse on Shabbos is liable for theft. Why wouldn't he be liable for theft? He stole a purse. The issue here, well, I'll let Rav Steinsaltz explain it, based on the principle that one who is liable to receive two punishments receives only the greater of the two punishments. So in this case, one might think that he should be exempt from paying for the theft because the performance of a prohibited labor on Shabbos is punishable by death. Now, that's a death penalty that maybe was imposed once in history for the wood gatherer among the children of Israel in the wilderness when the Torah was first given, shortly after it was given at Mount Sinai, and with God, I mean literally a manifestation of God's presence in the camp. Somebody went and violated Shabbos, and they made an example of him, as it were. But normally, a death penalty is only given even if there is a law that one would be subject to a death penalty. The perpetrator is only going to receive the actual death penalty if he was warned immediately before he did it that if you do that, you're going to be subject to the death penalty. And then he did it immediately. And there were two witnesses not only to the action, but also to the warning. So don't get all freaked out. Nobody in the last 3,000 years has been put to death for violating Shabbos. However, the point here is, and this is important, that if you become liable to two penalties at the same time, it's a feature of Talmudic of Torah law that you're only going to receive the heavier punishment, right? It's not like American law where the prosecutor piles on charges and punishments and then you get all the punishments, right? So in Torah law, you only get the bigger punishment. So here, if he was liable to the death penalty and he was liable for theft, meaning he would have to return not only what he stole, but a penalty of 100% of the value. So he has to pay back double what he stole. But if he's liable to the death penalty for violating Shabbos, and he violated Shabbos at the same time that he violated the law of stealing, then he would only be liable to the death penalty and he wouldn't have to pay the fine. However, that's only the case if he became liable to both penalties at the same moment. If he became liable for theft and then afterward he became liable for violating Shabbos, then they didn't happen at the same time and he would be liable for both penalties. That's what's going on here. Now, the reason he is liable in this case, in apparent contradiction to that principle of you only receive the heavier of the two penalties, is that he already became liable for the theft as soon as he lifted the purse. And that's why we're learning this right now, because lifting is a mode of acquisition. We're only talking about theft and Shabbos, etc., to get to this feature of that law, that lifting is when you took it as your own. In this case, in that case, he stole it. But what we're talking about is, okay, so movable property, lifting is how you acquire it. And this occurred before he came to violate the prohibition of performing prohibited labor on Shabbos by carrying the purse into the public domain, right? Like if if you have a wallet and it's on the table next to you and I lift the wallet right in front of you, I haven't stolen it from you. All I did is lift your wallet, literally lift off the table. But if I take the wallet, right, and leave that domain, let's say I lift it in your house and then I leave your house and enter the public domain with it. Okay, so the moment I stole it is when I took the wallet out of your house. But I became, that's when I violated Shabbos. But you could say that if I lifted it and grabbed it, especially if I put it in my pocket, maybe that's when I stole it, right? So these are, I misspoke there. He became liable for theft when he lifted it. He became liable for violating Shabbos when he took it out of the house and he transferred it from a private domain to a public domain. My mistake. Now, the Baraisa continues, if he did not lift the purse, but he was dragging it. So I really misspoke, because the point is that when he lifted it, that's when he stole it, right? When he lifted it and exerted control over it, especially if you put it in his pocket, right? Now, the Baraisa continues, if he did not lift the purse in order to acquire it, but rather he was dragging it on the ground and exiting the private domain, continuously dragging and exiting, then he would be exempt, because since he pulled an item that is normally lifted, so then pulling does not acquire it. What they're saying is the proof that pulling does not acquire an item that is normally lifted in order for it to be acquired is because in this ruling about whether one becomes liable for both theft and violating Shabbos, if he dragged the wallet out of the house, right, then it only became his when he took it out of that domain, and which was at the exact same moment when he violated Shabbos, by taking an object from the private domain out to the public domain. So since the theft and the Shabbos violation happened at the same moment, that's why he's only liable to the penalty for Shabbos, which is a bigger penalty than the penalty for theft. Now the Baraisa continues, if he did not, if he dragged it out the door, then he's exempt, as the prohibition of performing labor on Shabbos and the prohibition of theft were violated simultaneously the moment he drags the purse out of the owner's property into the public domain. Therefore, he receives only the greater punishment, death, for carrying on Shabbos, if it could be proven in the sentence carried out. But here we're not really talking about whether he's actually going to be executed. We're just talking about that the liability inures at the same moment. Now, Rav Ada Bar Matana explains his objection. But a purse is an item that can be lifted. And even so, it is apparent from the Baraisa that one acquires it by means of pulling. How then can it be stated that items that are typically lifted are not acquired if they are pulled? And Abaye said to him, the Bryce is referring to a case where the thief pulled the purse with a rope. So Rav Ada bar Matana thought that Abaye meant that the thief happened to drag it with a rope, and he responded, okay, so I also state my question, even in the case where he pulled the purse with a rope, as it is still evident that one can acquire the purse by means of pulling it instead of lifting. And Abaye said to him, I meant that the Bryce is referring to an item that requires a rope. In other words, it is a purse that is so large that it cannot be lifted, and it must be pulled. Therefore, it is acquired by means of pulling. Right? A purse of money that's so large, no one can lift it. Right? Bag of gold, so big, you can't pick it up. You have to pull it, and so you acquire it by pulling. But we have not learned whether an item that is light enough to normally be lifted can also be acquired by pulling. So the Gemara raises another objection. Come in here. If the merchandise is in the domain of the seller, okay, so the merchandise is in the seller's store, let's imagine, the buyer does not acquire the merchandise until he lifts it, okay, lifts we understand, or until he removes it from the domain of the seller. So maybe he's pulling it, but just the fact that he pulled it from its place, moved it a few feet across the floor within the store of the seller, he hasn't acquired it. He has to pull it out the door. Only then does he formally acquire the merchandise. So apparently, with regard to an item that can be lifted, if he so desires, he acquires it by lifting. And if he so desires, he acquires it by pulling. Okay, but he has to pull it out the door. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, this is not a proof, as it can be explained that the Tana teaches it disjunctively, i.e., the two options are referring to two different cases. In the case of an item that can be lifted, he acquires it by lifting. Whereas with regard to an item that can be pulled, he acquires it by pulling. But we haven't stated whether an item that can be lifted could also be acquired if it is pulled. Now we're on page 86b. So the Gemara suggests a different case. Come in here a proof from the Mishna on page 84b that even items that are usually lifted can be acquired by means of pulling. How do we prove it? With regard to one who sells produce to another, if the buyer pulled the produce, but he did not measure it, so he has acquired it. And the Gemara explains how this is a proof. But produce can be lifted, and yet the Mishnah teaches that it is acquired by means of pulling. So of course the Gemara rejects this proof and says, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with large bundles that are pulled from place to place and are not carried because they're so large and heavy. So the Gemara asks, well, if that is so, then say that the latter clause of that Mishnah, where it says that one who buys flax from another has not acquired it until he carries it from this place to another place, i.e., it is acquired only through lifting and not via pulling. Is that to say that flax is not prepared in large bundles? Flax comes in large bundles, and yet you're saying you cannot pull it, you can only lift it. And the Gemara answers, well, yes, but flax is different. Unlike other produce, flax is not packed in large bundles as it would slip from its place. Rather, it is packed in smaller bundles, and therefore, flax is acquired specifically through lifting. There's an exception made for flax. It must be lifted. We haven't learned out whether for other objects that are small enough to be lifted, if pulling will accomplish the acquisition. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, come in here a proof from a Mishnah Tractate Kedushin, page 25b. Large domesticated animals are acquired through passing the animal's leash to the buyer. That's called passing. And small domesticated animals are acquired through lifting, like a chicken. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. And the rabbis say, which means that this is what the majority says, the others were the minority opinion. And the rabbis say small domesticated animals are acquired through pulling. And Ravina explains the proof, but small domesticated animals are creatures that can be lifted, and yet the Mishnah teaches that one acquires them through pulling. So it must be that pulling works even for an object that can be lifted. But Rav Ashi says, no, you haven't proven that, because domesticated animals are different, as they cling to the ground and it is difficult to lift them. Therefore, the usual manner of moving animals is to pull them. New subject. The Gemara cites another case with regard to sales. Rav and Shmuel both say, if a seller said to a buyer, I am selling you 1 kor. So this is a unit of volume that is used to measure grain that's been harvested. So I am selling you 1 kor, and that is a measure equivalent to 30 sa of grain. You know, think bags of grain, think bushels of grain, but this is how we measure grain that's been harvested. So a kor is equal to 30 sa. A bathtub is about 40 sa. Okay, so this kor is about what fits in a bathtub, more or less. So I am selling you 1 kor, a measure equivalent to 30 sa, and I'm selling you this kor for the price of 30 sela, right? So that means that each sa, it's 1 sa per sela. A sela is a coin, right? So the kor equals 30 sa. I'm selling you the kor for 30 sela. That means 1 sa per sela. Okay, you got that? So I'm selling you a kor for 30 sela. So if this is the deal that they made, the seller can renege on the sale as long as the measuring vessel is not filled. In other words, until the full kor has been measured out, he could change his mind because it hasn't changed hands. The full 30 sa has not been measured out, so the seller can back out of that sale. By contrast, if the seller said, I am selling you 1 kor for 30 sela, same deal, but he added a few extra words and he said, I'm selling you 1 kor for 30 sela and each sa for 1 sela. So now it was unnecessary to say, but he said it, that each sa is 1 sela. That was already implied when he said 1 kor for 30 sela. But when he adds the words 1 sa per sela, now as he's filling grain into the measuring vessel, every time 1 sa goes into that vessel, it is sold. The seller can't back out of that because now he's established a unit price. And even though we could have deducted that, okay, well, it's 1 sa per sela, but when he said, I'm selling you 1 kor for 30 sela, the unit was a kor. And so he can back out of the deal until the full unit is delivered. But now that he added extra words and said a sa per sela, so now he has made the basic unit of this sale the sa. And now each time he adds a sa into the measuring vessel, that particular sa is sold. Now the Gemara raises a difficulty from the Baraisa that was cited on page 85a. Come in here. If the measuring vessel belonged to one of them, meaning the buyer or the seller, so then the buyer acquires the items of sale one by one. And since this law is stated in general terms, it indicates that the buyer acquires each item as it is placed in the measuring vessel, even though the measuring vessel was not filled. So this would be consistent with the second teaching that if he added the words 1 sa per sela, each sa is sold as it's added to the measuring vessel. But it would contradict the first part where it said that I'm selling you 1 kor for 30 sela and then the deal is not done until the full kor has been measured out. So here it seems to say, okay, but if the measuring vessel belong to one of them, no, then everything that gets added to the measuring vessel is sold as soon as it hits the measuring vessel, even though the total hasn't been added to the vessel. And the Gemara answers, the Baraisa is referring to a case where the seller said to him, I am selling you 1 hin. Now, kor and sa, those were units of volume used for measuring dry produce. A hin is a unit of volume used for measuring wet produce, i.e. liquids. Okay, so I am selling you 1 hin, and this is a liquid measure equivalent to 12 log. So if I'm selling you 1 hin for 12 sela, then I'm selling you 1 hin for 12 sela, and he added the words 1 log per sela. Right? So now he took the unit from the 1 hin down to the 1 log. And this is in accordance with an observation that Rav Kahana says, in the Holy Temple, there were markings on the vessel that measured hin, with which one could measure the different libations that were used for the sacrifices brought on the altar. So here too, there were markings on the measuring vessels, a measuring cup, right, with gradients, with various levels of how much has been added to the measuring cup. So here too, there were markings on the measuring vessels, and since the measuring vessel indicates at which point each log has been filled, the buyer acquires it, and this is comparable to the case of one who sells each sa individually. So the Gemara raises another difficulty. Come in here, one who hires a laborer in the winter or the spring to work for him in the harvest for 1 dinar a day, and a day of a laborer's work during the harvest is worth a sela, which is the equivalent of 4 silver dinars per day. So it is prohibited to derive benefit from him. What just happened? Okay, so the harvest, here in America, usually the harvest is in the fall. But in the Holy Land, which is a desert, the harvest is actually often in the spring. But at any rate, there's a harvest season. So during the harvest season, it's difficult to find laborers. So the demand for laborers goes way up. So the work that normally an employer could get a day's work from a laborer for 1 dinar, during the harvest season, where there's not enough laborers, he has to pay 4 dinars. Simple economics, supply and demand. So what they're saying is, if I can find, because I'm going to have trouble finding workers during the harvest season, so if I go to this worker 3 months early, where he's having trouble finding work, and I say to him, listen, I know that you're hard pressed, you need money now. Well, I'm going to need workers at harvest time. So I'll tell you what, I will hire you now to do work for me in the harvest. I'll pay you a dinar a day now, but I'll give you the dinar now. And then you just have to come back at harvest time and work for me, for this dinar a day. I'm paying you 4 dinars for 4 days work, but I want you to do those 4 days work during the harvest season. So this is not permitted, right? This is not permitted. Why? Because the worker is willing to do it, even though he could get 4 dinars for his time during harvest season. He's willing to do it because right now he needs the money. So he's going to, essentially, he's borrowing money, right? He's taking the money now, but he owes for that money. What does he owe? He owes his time, his labor. So he's going to pay me back 4 days worth of labor, or 4 dinars essentially, for the 1 dinar that I'm giving him now. That is it's too similar to a loan with interest. And I mean, really high interest, right? And so therefore, lending at interest, a Jew cannot lend to another Jew at interest. That violates usury, the usury law, the usury prohibition. And so here, even though it doesn't, what are you talking about? There's no loan, there's no interest, but it produces the same effect as a loan at interest. And that's why it is prohibited. But if one hires him already from now to work for 1 dinar a day for an extended period of time, which includes the harvest season, and the work of a laborer during the harvest is worth a sela, this is permitted. I can hire him now and say, all right, listen, I'm going to pay you a dinar per day of work, and you're going to keep working for me during the harvest season. Now, I'm just paying him a dinar per day. Now, it's true that during the harvest season, he could quit and go get more money elsewhere, but he's going to be loyal to me because I'm hiring him when it's very difficult to get work. And he's going to have steady work during the whole fallow season when other workers are hungry and not able to work. And so it's worth it to him to give up, the 4 dinars a day he could be getting every day during the harvest season to get a dinar per day the whole year. And that's why it's worth it to him, it's worth it to me, it's a good deal, and it does not resemble interest because he's simply taking a job for a dinar a day and staying with it for an extended amount of time. And if it enters your mind, as Rav and Shmuel claim, that if a seller said, I am selling you 1 kor for 30 sela, and that and then adds the words each sa for 1 sela, and that he cannot fully renege on the sale in the middle of the transaction as the buyer acquires each sa one by one as it is measured, then the law in our case of the worker should be different. Here too, as he does not agree to one large sum, but fixes a price for each day, one by one, it is akin to taking interest, as the laborer works and receives less than he is entitled to in exchange for an early payment, and therefore it should be prohibited to derive benefit from him, even if I'm hiring him for a dinar per day starting now. Whereas our Baraisa said that if one hires him from now to work for 1 dinar a day over an extended period of time, including the harvest, and 1 day of a laborer's work during the harvest is worth 4 dinars, that it is permitted. Why is it permitted? But isn't it payment for waiting, i.e. for advancing the money to the laborer? And Rava said, no. How can you understand the Baraisa in that manner? Is it prohibited for one to lower his hiring price and receive lower wages in order to ensure that he is employed? This arrangement is not a form of interest and violates no prohibition. It benefits the laborer because while he's going to be working cheaply during the harvest season, the rest of the year he has a guaranteed job, which maybe his colleagues don't have. And he's already made the calculation that it's definitely worth it for him to do that. And the Gemara asks, well, if this is not considered taking interest, then what is different in the first clause, where the laborer is not employed immediately, and then the arrangement is prohibited if he simply receives his money now in order to provide work during the harvest? Why is that prohibited? And why is that prohibited? And the Gemara explains, in the first clause, the one that's prohibited, as the laborer does not work with the employer from now, it has the appearance of payment for waiting, i.e. advancing the money to the laborer. He's going to get it now and then provide repayment later at a higher rate than what he received right now. And that's just very similar to interest. And it's quite different than taking a job for a dinar a day that begins today, because he's getting a dinar per day all during that period. I am very close to done for today, so if you've got questions or comments, please get them in now. The Mishnah teaches, and if the flax, okay, back to our Mishnah number 8, and with this we're going to complete Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 5. This is, again, about acts of acquisition. And if the flax was attached to the ground when the seller sold it to the buyer, the flax was still, it hadn't been harvested yet, so it's still in the ground. And if the flax was attached to the ground and the buyer detached any amount of it, he has acquired all of it, all of that he agreed to purchase. And the Gemara asks, is it correct to say that due to the fact that he detached any amount, he acquired, meaning he acquired all of it? If he does not perform an active acquisition with all the flax, how can he acquire all of it by just cutting some of it from the ground? And Rav Sheshes said, here we are dealing with a case where the seller said to the buyer, go and clear for yourself any amount of land and thereby acquire everything that is on it. And how does this work? It means that when the buyer clears the land by detaching flax from some of it, he is considered to be renting the land, paying for it with this little bit of labor, and thereby, since he rented the land temporarily, he's able to use his land, right, that he rented from the seller, just for a moment, in order to acquire all the flax that is on it, right? So you can, because I can use my land to acquire for me. If a seller is selling me something and he deposits on my land, then my land has done the acquisition for me. And if I'm standing on the seller's land, but I rent a piece of that property from him for the purposes of finalizing this acquisition, and then he deposits my property that I'm buying in that land that I just rented from him, then technically it's my land and it acquired the property for me, the movable property for me, and the sale has been finalized. The formal acquisition has taken place. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 5. And God willing, tomorrow we'll continue with Mishnah number 9. Nina's telling me no questions today. So that's what I've got. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday at the regular time.